कि हमारा मदरसा अल-कुबा उसका कोई और मकसद नहीं है। मैं सिर्फ ये चाहता हूँ कि अहले सुन्नत के कुछ अफराद नौजवान तैयार हो जाएं, हमें बच्चे दें और मौलवी लें।
Welcome back to another one of our weekly lessons, where Alhamdulillah we're making our way through Imam Al-Tahawi's explanation of the creed of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, and we're talking about the attributes of Allah Ta'ala, and in the last lesson we finished on the discussion of Khaliqun bila Haja. Yani Allah Ta'ala is a creator and He creates without need. There was no need for Allah Ta'ala to create anything. Allah Ta'ala being the supreme creator, the omnipotent, the all-powerful, the one free of all dependency, He creates without any need. And then continuing with those type of discussions, the Imam Al-Tahawi then he says next, he says, Raziqun bila mu'na, or in some copies, or some manuscripts, this word mu'na will say ma'una instead. So Raziqun bila mu'na, it means that Allah Ta'ala, He creates and He gives rizq, so He distributes sustenance without any difficulty, without any stores, without any need to save things behind. So what does that relate to? It relates to the idea that Allah Ta'ala, He is the one who has power over all things, and everything is dependent upon Allah, including the sustenance that I and you receive. So I believe that's where we finished in the last lesson, wasn't it? Or did we do this one? We did this one possibly. Yeah. So today then we continue with the next thing, which is the attribute of Allah Ta'ala. Allah Ta'ala is Mumitun bila makhafa. Mumit bila makhafa. Yani Allah Ta'ala, He gives death without fear. And bila makhafa, without any cause for concern for anything. Now what's this relating to? It's alluding to this idea that Allah Ta'ala isn't afflicted by emotions in the same way that I and you are. If somebody, for example, placed a child in front of you and said, he is the mother, he is the father, kill the parents, what will you do? You will hesitate because of the fact that the parents are there. Sorry, the child is there. In the sense that you're saying that the child needs the parents, so we don't want to kill the parents because the child needs them, for example. Or you might feel as though you're killing for a different ulterior motive. Allah Ta'ala is free from all of these things when He gives death. Allah Ta'ala, when He causes things to die, He is Mumit. This is His attribute. Death comes from Allah Ta'ala. When Allah Ta'ala gives death to any of the creation, He does so without any fear. There's nothing which prevents Allah Ta'ala from exercising His attributes, including the attribute of giving death. Ba'ithun bila mashaqqa. Yani Allah Ta'ala, this next part now, the first thing was Khaliq, now we come to Ba'ith. So what's the difference between Khaliq and Ba'ith? Khaliq means to create. Like we talked about earlier, Khaliq means to create in the first instance, let's say. Ba'ith means to resurrect. So we have a firm belief, and this is part of our beliefs as Muslims, that Allah Ta'ala will resurrect us on the Day of Judgment. This life isn't the be-all end-all, right? This isn't the end of our existence. Allah Ta'ala will give life again after we die. So when we finish from this world, and then we go into the next world, which is the realm of the grave, Alam Barzakh, after the Barzakhi life, then when Allah Ta'ala raises us again, this is what we call the Bi'tha. We call this the Bi'tha, yani life after death. وَالْبَعْثِ بَعْدَ الْمَوْتِ. That's what that means. وَالْبَعْثِ بَعْدَ الْمَوْتِ, yani the resurrection after the death. So after a person dies and leaves this world, the resurrection is true. Now, why is this mentioned as part of the attributes of Allah Ta'ala? It's mentioned as part of the attributes of Allah Ta'ala because it shows His ultimate power. How? Allah Ta'ala, He created from nothingness. When we first were created, there was no previous body there was no previous substance there from which Allah Ta'ala creates. Allah Ta'ala created from nothingness. Now when He gives resurrection, Allah Ta'ala will resurrect in a way that He resurrects from that which is left over. Does He depend on that which is left over? The answer is no. Allah Ta'ala doesn't depend on anything to bring about resurrection. So just try to pay attention to that. Allah Ta'ala doesn't depend on anything to bring about resurrection. When we say bi'atha, bringing about again, it's harder to bring something into existence when there's nothing there to start with. When there's nothing there to start with, it becomes harder to bring something into existence than when there's something left over, your dust, your bones, or whatever you want to think about. Allah Ta'ala is ba'ith. And again, ba'ith bila mashaqqa. When Allah Ta'ala gives life again in the next world, Allah Ta'ala does so without any difficulty. Why does Imam Al-Tahawi mention this? Because he's not mentioning it expressly, but he's alluding to the fact that we believe in the hereafter. Later on in the book, what's Imam Al-Tahawi going to do? Later on in the book, Imam Al-Tahawi will mention about what our beliefs about the hereafter are. Heaven, hell, resurrection, mizan, the scales, the sirat, etc. All of this will come afterwards. But for now, he's just alluding to the idea that who is it that causes or instigates the day of judgment and the resurrection? Allah is the one who is ba'ith. Allah is ba'ith. Now on this, that's the end of sort of this part of the discussion. The next thing is about something else. On this, there's an important thing to understand. When you read, for example, in the Quran, that Allah Ta'ala has, this angel has appointed an angel to take the soul, the angel of death, Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam, right? There's an angel which is appointed to send revelation, Sayyidina Jibreel alayhi salam. There's an angel which is control of the clouds. There's an angel which brings the thunder. There's an angel which brings the rain. There's an angel for a lot of things. There's an angel that records the deeds on one side. Another angel will record the bad deeds. Kiraman Katibin. A question that might arise is, why has Allah Ta'ala appointed these duties to all of these angels when He didn't need them? If He's, for example, as we say, Khaliqun bila haja, He has no need for the creation. This is Raziqun bila mu'na, He gives sustenance without any difficulty. Mumitun bila makhafa, He causes death without any fear of anything. Ba'ithun bila mashaqqa. These are all of His attributes. Then what benefit is raised, or what benefit is achieved by having these angels? This comes back to what we said previously. This is the nizam of Allah Ta'ala. This is the system of Allah Ta'ala, that these angels and these, if you would like, assignment of duties, this is just metaphorical, if you would, right? This is like majazi, just metaphorical. In reality, Allah is the true doer of everything. Allah is the true doer, the true fa'il of everything. Anything which we do, anything that happens, Allah Ta'ala is the one who does it. Now just think to yourself about anything which is happening, anything. The fact that you just took a breath in, the fact that you just took a breath out, that wasn't your brain and your nerves and your lungs and all of this. All of this is just a means by which Allah Ta'ala manifested His power. All of this is just a means by which Allah Ta'ala manifested His power. Otherwise, I and you were only able to breathe because Allah willed us to breathe. And I and you were only able to breathe back out because Allah willed us to breathe back out. Everything is dependent upon Allah. Allah is the true doer of everything. Taking the soul, Allah takes the soul. But He does so through the angel of death. Does He need to take it through the angel of death? Like logically speaking, is it possible for Allah to take the soul directly? The answer is yes, because Allah is not dependent upon the angels. Is it possible for Allah Ta'ala, for example, to send the rain directly as opposed to through an angel? The answer is yes. Does Allah Ta'ala need the angels to record the deeds? Like what is this recording? You know, Ali-Ayazu Billah, they say, Nakle kufr na bashe, to like imitate kufr is not kufr, but just for the sake of learning. Are we saying that the deeds are being recorded because there's, you know, it might be forgotten what we did? No, nothing like that. Rather, it's just a manifestation of the sabab, reminding us, part of the test, that when you look at these asbab in the world, when you look at these intermediary means in the world, then what do you believe? Are you believing that it's your food that's giving you sustenance? Are you believing that it's your employer that's your raziq? Are you believing that it's your lungs that are giving you air? Are you believing that it's your eyes that are allowing you to see? No. The Muslim understands and has a firm belief everything that happens with us and anything which happens anywhere happens because Allah allows it to happen. That's why we say that everything is dependent upon the qudra and the irada of Allah Ta'ala. If the qudra, the power, and the irada, the intending of Allah Ta'ala doesn't happen, then what we would say is that this would never manifest. Nothing would ever come to fruition. So that's why Imam Al-Tahawi, he words it in this way, Khaliq bila haja. So that a person doesn't fall into the mistake of thinking that Allah Ta'ala needed any of this. Allah is free of need, the creation is needy towards Allah. So that's that first sort of type of discussion which we have. The next part then he talks about broadly coming back to the sifat of Allah Ta'ala. He then says, Imam Tahawi, he says, مَا زَالَ بِصِفَاتِهِ قَدِيمًا قَبْلَ خَلْقِهِ لَمْ يَزْدَدْ بِكَوْنِهِمْ شَيْئًا لَمْ يَكُنْ قَبْلَهُمْ مِنْ صِفَتِهِ. So I'll translate it and then we'll talk about what it means. So the translation of this text is, Allah Ta'ala remained Qadim. Allah Ta'ala remained Qadim. Qadim means that He always existed. There was never a time when Allah Ta'ala didn't exist. Right? That's what Qadim is. Remember we talked about this when we said Wajib didn't be Wajib al-Wujud, that it means there's only one being that's like this, Allah. Every other being had a time where it didn't exist and then it came into existence. Even the Prophet ﷺ. There was a time when the Prophet ﷺ didn't exist and then he comes into existence. The only being that never had this Adam, this non-existence is Allah, and that's it. Allah is the only one that always existed and always will exist, Qadim. So he says that Allah is Qadim with His sifat. Yani all of the attributes of Allah are also Qadim. All of the attributes of Allah are such that they always existed as well. It was never the case that Allah's attributes didn't exist. Now this is where you have to sort of pay attention a little bit. When the creation didn't exist, so when the creation wasn't there, there was no makhluk, there was no creation, was Allah still the creator? When there was nothing to give sustenance to, was Allah still raziq? When there was nothing to know, was Allah still alim? When there was nothing kada wa kada, then was Allah, and then relate the attribute to it. This is how we pose the question. And the answer to the question is yes. Allah being Khaliq is part of His attributes. They're not dependent upon the creation. Allah is Khaliq even if there's no makhluk. Allah is a creator even if there's no creation, because Allah being Khaliq, being the creator, is not dependent upon the makhluk. Allah being Raziq, being the sustainer, being the one who gives sustenance, that's not dependent upon there being something to sustain. This is the nature of Allah's attributes, all of them. All of the attributes of Allah are such that we don't affirm any type of dependency for them. Allah is not dependent upon anything in His dhat, in His sifat, nor in His af'al. And not in His being. He's not dependent on anything to exist as a being. He's not dependent upon anything to exist in His attributes, and He's not dependent upon anything to exist in terms of the actions that come from Allah Ta'ala. That's where we differ from our actions. Can you be a writer if you've never written anything? No? You can't, can you? Your being a writer, your attribute is dependent upon something. Can you be somebody who's eaten if you haven't eaten anything? If you've never eaten in your whole life, can you say, I'm an eater as well? If you've never ever tasted fruit before, can you say, yeah, I've tasted food? The nature of our attributes is that our attributes are all dependent upon something. Whereas the attributes of Allah Ta'ala are not dependent upon anything. Because the minute you affirm dependency, now this is the key point. The minute you affirm dependency, at that point what happens is you're then affirming that Allah is like the creation. And remember, we can never ever affirm that Allah is like the creation. Because when you affirm that Allah is like the creation, then what have you done? You've made Allah hadith. You've made Allah contingent. You've made Him limited in His existence. Everything that you have, and this underpins all of the discussions on the attributes of Allah, Everything that you have with the attributes of Allah, with the Zat of Allah, with the Sifat of Allah, everything has to be different to the creation. I come back to the point that we raised all those lessons ago. People who say that Allah is up, you can't say that. Why? Because being up is a jihad, is a direction. If you're up, then that means you're not down. If you're up, then you're limited because this is a relative direction. You start from a point where you aren't and you work from there. You limit Allah to a place. What things are up, the creation is up. The creation has directions. When you affirm body parts, right, or those people who do, Allah has a hand, Allah has a face, Allah has a shin, these are all people who misunderstand the Quran. Allah is not like the creation. I have a face, you have a face. When you think about the hand of a man, you think of this hand with fingers and a thumb and the joints and the movements and the need to grasp and the feeling and so on and so forth. The yad of Allah is not like the yad of the creation. And anyone who affirms the existence of Allah with a body, that person is not worshipping Allah, that person is worshipping a figment of their imagination. Because Allah is free from all of these things. It's utter misguidance to affirm a body for Allah. Remember that. To affirm a body for Allah, this is utter and absolute misguidance. Allah is free from all of these things. Because for Allah, these are all defects. Why do we not affirm the attributes of creation for Allah? That's the question, right? Somebody might have it in their mind. Why are we not affirming the attributes of the creation for Allah? The answer is simply, we don't affirm the attributes of creation for Allah because the attributes of creation, when applied to Allah, are a defect for Him. Like for example, the strongest of the strongest person. The strongest person you can think of, a time comes where his strength fails him. The most knowledgeable of knowledgeable people that you know, a time comes where they don't know something. The person who's the best of the best at whatever you're thinking of, a time comes when that attribute will fail them. Allah is not like that. Allah is free from these limitations, Allah is free from all of these needs, and that's why we have to remind ourselves that this is the remake in which we're talking about the sifat of Allah Ta'ala. So then he says, as we just mentioned, لم يزدد بكونهم شيئا لم يكن قبله من صفته. Yani simply put, Allah Ta'ala, His attributes don't increase or decrease. Allah's attributes don't increase or decrease. Now what do we mean when we talk about these attributes increasing and decreasing? Let's think about this. If we say that the attributes of Allah have increased, we say that the attributes of Allah have increased. Like, let's frame it as a question or as an example. So when Allah Ta'ala created the creation, then something increased in His attributes. What are we actually saying there? Or why is it problematic? What we're actually saying there is, we're saying that before that, Allah was defective. Al-Iyazu Billah. Allah was lacking in something. Then when the creation came into existence, then Allah was complete. Do you see why that's so problematic? That's why we never affirm a change for Allah. Allah is complete, exactly and perfect as He is. And that we can't comprehend in our own minds. Because the creation doesn't have the ability to comprehend the Zat of Allah. The creation doesn't have the ability to comprehend Allah. So there's everybody following, because these are some complex things. So as I say all the time, look, whenever you get a question in this subject, please ask it straight away. Yeah, please ask it straight away. Are there any questions so far? No? Okay. So the next piece of text then that he comes to, وَكَمَا كَانَ بِصِفَاتِهِ أَزَلِيًّا كَذَلِكَ لَا يَزَالُ عَلَيْهَا أَبَدِيًّا. Just like Allah Ta'ala was with His attributes always, eternally, pre-eternally, likewise He will be abadiyan, forever and ever afterwards as well. Coming back to the idea that Allah Ta'ala's attributes don't change. Yeah, Allah Ta'ala's attributes, they don't change. Because as I said, if you affirm any change in the attributes of Allah, then what have you done? You're assuming then that there's a defect there before the change came about. Or, if there's a decrease, now there's something defective with the Zat of Allah Ta'ala. Because now something is missing that was there before. Now there is something missing that was there before. So now when you look at this idea of increase and decrease, When you look at the idea of increase and decrease, you don't look at it in the way that we look at I increasing and decreasing. My increase and decrease doesn't mean that I was worse or better than before. Rather, with the sifat of Allah Ta'ala, what we affirm is that Allah is free from change. This next point is extremely important. So the next point is, why is Allah free from change? Why is Allah free from change? Allah is free from change because change is the sign of creation. Remember that. Allah is free from change because changing is the sign of creation. Everything in the creation that you see, think about it, it changes. Humans, when you're born, you're running around like this. When you get a bit older, then your body's a bit bigger. You get a bit older, you get a bit older, you're changing, constantly changing. Every moment, a human is changing. Look at the inanimate objects of the world. Trees, look at the way the seasons progress. We're coming into winter and autumn and things. The leaves are changing color, they're falling, they're growing, they're changing. The nature of creation is that it changes. Allah is free from change because change, by definition, is indicative of being limited. That's why we never affirm any change for Allah. We never ever affirm any changing, any taghayyur for Allah Ta'ala. That's why when Imam Al-Tahawi talks about this point, he alludes to this idea. He says that like Allah Ta'ala was azaliyan, in pre-eternity, He remains so abadiyan forever and ever. Number one. Number two, this text is important for a different reason. It alludes to the point that time doesn't apply to Allah. Time does not apply to Allah. We talked about this last time. Why do we say that time doesn't apply to Allah? Sorry?
Because He's free from everything.
Exactly. Allah Ta'ala is free from everything that's creation. The time, space, physics, whatever way you look at them, right? All of this is creation. So Allah is free from the rules of creation. If you bound Allah by time, then what you're doing is you're binding Allah by the creation. If you bind Allah by space, you're binding Allah by the creation. Bind Allah with anything to do with the creation, and that one that's being bound is not Allah. It can't be God. The Christians bind their God in the body of Jesus according to them. That's not God to us. Right? That's not God to us. These idols that they create, like the Buddhists and all of these Hindus and so on, these aren't God to us. Just tell them not to stop. Don't talk. Sorry, there was a question.
Did you repeat that bit where you said why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't change?
Why?
Why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala doesn't change?
Yeah. So why do we say that Allah Ta'ala doesn't change? Because changing, that's a hallmark of creation. Creation changes. If something has a beginning and something has an end, as it's working its way towards that end, it's changing. So change is a sign that it started at a point and it ended at a point. That's the nature of what change is. Change indicates upon ibtida and intiha, beginning and an end. So that's why we don't affirm a change for Allah, because if there's any change for Allah, then that means that there was a start and an end. But of course, as we say, Allah is azali and abadi. He existed forever to start with, and He existed forever afterwards as well.
Do these are problematic ways? Do we have any idea why Allah chose to use them to describe Himself?
Sorry, say again.
Do you know like the problematic things? Do you have any idea why Allah chose to use them to describe Himself?
I think I've understood your question, but just correct me if I'm wrong. What you're saying is, those things which are ambiguous and unclear, why did Allah Ta'ala describe Himself with those things?
Do we know? Do we know that?
Yeah. So the question is, why did Allah Ta'ala describe Himself in these ways in which we can't understand? Number one is part of the test. Remember, Islam is to believe in that which you can believe in. Allah Ta'ala told us that you can understand X, Y, and Z, so we understand them. Allah told us we have to believe in these things, but we don't understand them, that's belief. So with regards to the attributes of Allah, what do we affirm? We affirm that there are certain things that we know about Allah, and that we can understand and that we can believe and we can affirm, and there are certain things that we know that we can't understand. Yet we still affirm them even though we can't understand them. That's how we understand, that's how we deal with our Aqidah and our belief regarding Allah Ta'ala. Any other questions? So then he continues, so he says, ليس بعد خلق الخلق استفاد اسم الخالق ولا بإحداثه البرية استفاد اسم الباري. So this is something that we've already touched upon, where it just talks about the idea that Allah Ta'ala, He didn't become the Khaliq, He didn't become the creator after He created. Allah was always Khaliq. Why was He always Khaliq? 2 reasons I've given you. Anyone? Let me see if you were paying attention or you were just staring at me. So what are the 2 reasons? Go on, number 1.
Does Khaliq link to Qadim?
Yes.
So like it never had like a beginning, like it always existed.
So it's basically, it's not dependent on the creation. It never had a beginning because Allah's attributes are all Qadim. If Allah's attributes are all Qadim, it has no relation with the Hadith creation. That's one reason. What's the second reason? Anyone? What's the second reason?
The increase point. Then if we then there will be increase in attributes and attributes won't change.
Yeah, it would be related to change. If you say that Allah wasn't Khaliq, then He created the creation, then He became Khaliq, what are you affirming for the Zat and the Sifat of Allah? Change. And what did we say about change? You can't affirm change for Allah. Changing is the nature of creation. Allah is free from change. Where do you see this in the Quran? Like, you might be thinking he's just saying this off the top of his head. Look, like you see verses in the Quran. La tabdeela li kalimatillah. La tabdeela li kalimatillah. The words of Allah don't change. La tabdeel. There's no changing with the words of Allah. So these type of verses, that's the ma'na with which we understand them. That's the ma'na with which we understand them. Good. Any other questions? So that's basically what that line of text is. So I'm not going to explain it any further because I think, mashallah, you've got it and I think we've already explained it. It says, after creating the creation, Allah didn't increase, He didn't gain this name of being a creator, and nor by bringing the creation into existence did He gain this attribute of Bari. Bari is one of the names of Allah. It means the one who originates, the one who brings into existence. Allah is free from all of this. You know, sometimes people refer to Allah Ta'ala, they say, Bari Ta'ala. Bari Ta'ala. Bari is just the Arabic word Bari'un. Bari'un means to bring into existence. That is because Allah has power over all things. So now let's talk about this attribute, which is very important, because, why do I say it's important? It's an attribute which unfortunately many people misunderstand. What do we mean when we talk about the Qudra of Allah? When we say that Allah Ta'ala has the power to do everything, what does it mean? Now this is where you have to understand a few prerequisite concepts. Some first issue. So you can see, so what do we mean when we say that Allah Ta'ala is Qadir? What do we mean when we talk about the Qudra of Allah? The Qudra of Allah Ta'ala means His ability and His power. Allah has power to do all things. Yeah.
I think, do you know if it's raining one day and then it's not raining another day?
Yeah, exactly. So that's part of Allah Ta'ala's Qudra, of Allah's power. So when we talk about the Qudra of Allah, there's an important understanding that you have to have. When the Quran says that Allah has power over all things doesn't include the impossibilities. When we say Allah has power over everything, yani what we're saying is the Qudra of Allah relates to all things. Right? The Qudra of Allah relates to all things. What does that mean? It means that the Qudra of Allah Ta'ala will relate to all those things which are permissible and possible. Let me frame it as an example. Is it possible for Allah Ta'ala to be incapable of doing something?
No.
It's not, is it? Yeah, wake up. So is it possible for Allah Ta'ala to be incapable of doing something? Why? Because from the attributes that we've studied, La yu'jizuhu shay. Nothing can render Allah incapable of doing something. Right? Can Allah Ta'ala create a rock that He can't pick up?
Yeah.
Anyone?
Yeah.
So no. So the answer is no. Allah Ta'ala can't. Why do we say that? Now this is how we word it. We don't say that Allah doesn't have the qudra. We're not saying that Allah is incapable of doing X, Y, and Z. Rather, what we would say is that the question is flawed. Why is the question flawed? Because the question is asking in a different way, can the qudra of Allah relate to this impossible thing that you've examined? Can the qudra of Allah relate to this impossible thing that you've imagined? The impossibility, yani Allah creating a rock that He can't pick up, impossible. Will the qudra of Allah ever relate to that? No. That's the answer. The qudra of Allah will never ever relate to the impossibilities. It only ever relates to those things which are possible. So for example, can Allah Ta'ala create an entire creation again? Yes. Why are we saying yes? Because it's permissible. Creating creation is possible, it's mumkin, it's allowed. Can Allah Ta'ala, for example, create a two-headed giraffe? Yes. Why? Because it's permissible, it's possible. There's no impossibility that arises from here. There's no legal Islamic Shari'i impossibility that's arising from us saying these type of questions. So the qudra of Allah can relate to all of these things. But anything which we deem to be impossible, like the question that I presented, those type of questions are flawed, because there we would say that the qudra of Allah will not relate to those things. Yeah, there's a question here.
How do we know what's impossible for the power of Allah to relate to?
Very good. It's a very good question. How do we determine what's possible and what's not? Now this turns on a wide and a broad understanding of the Sharia. So, for example, when we raise this question of can Allah Ta'ala create a rock that He can't pick up? How did we determine that that was impossible? What did we do? Anyone?
Because you're affirming that picking up a rock is similar to humans and their actions.
That as well. That's one way of dealing with it. What's another way of dealing with it? Anyone? We said, didn't we, that if you affirm that Allah can't pick up a rock, this is ajiz. Allah Ta'ala is incapable. So anything which results in Allah being incapable, anything which results in Allah having a body, anything which results in Allah being like the creation, anything which negates any of His attributes, anything which results in something like two gods, anything which results in an impossibility, shar'an, this is impossible for Allah. The qudra of Allah will never relate to these things. Again, another question that we can raise, and we'll deal with it in the same way. What I want you to follow is not necessarily what I'm saying, but think about how I'm dealing with the objection. Okay? Think about how I'm dealing with the objection. Can Allah Ta'ala create another God? So let's work through it. Let's work through it step by step. So when you say that can Allah Ta'ala create another God, one of the ways of forming that question is, will the qudra of Allah relate to the existence or the creation of a second God? And we would say no. Why? Because what we've already established as part of our rules regarding the qudra of Allah was that the qudra of Allah will only ever relate to those things which are permissible. It won't relate to the impossibilities. The question then follows, what's so impossible of having a second God? Why is this impossible? And the answer simply is, if you affirm a second God, then what you've negated is the monotheism of Allah, the tawheed of Allah is negated. The existence of two gods, this is a logical impossibility like we spoke about when we were talking about the tawheed questions. Remember the dalil, burhan tamano, burhan tawarud that we talked about last time? So these are the reasons why we would then say that this is an impossibility. The minute you've established it to be impossible, the answer is Allah's qudra will not relate to that. The verse Inna Allah ala kulli shayin qadir, this doesn't relate to the impossibilities. Now that might be a little bit complex. Let me simplify with an analogy. Right? So alhamdulillah, we're all Muslims. If I was to say I'm not a fussy eater, I eat everything. For example, if I was to say I'm not a fussy eater at all, I eat everything. How many of you think that that includes pork? Anyone? Yes, no? Does anybody think that that includes haram foods? No. So now when your person says that Allah I eat everything, we understand that within the context that this is a Muslim, he doesn't eat haram food, so everything is limited in its application to that which is halal. Likewise, when we say that Allah Ta'ala has power over all things, what we understand there is that Allah's power relates, His qudra relates to only the possible things. Therefore, the idea of it relating to impossibilities is not logical. Again, finishing on this point now, when I said I eat everything and somebody turns around and says to me, oh, when's the last time you ate pork then? When's the last time you ate pork? What will you say? You'll simply say that obviously you didn't mean pork. Obviously you weren't talking about that. You were talking about halal foods. The idea of pork and haram being included within that statement, that's not logical. Likewise, how we understand Inna Allaha ala kulli shay'in qadir. So we'll stop there. I know there's a lot to digest there. So rather than overdoing it, we'll stop there. And we'll take questions. So I imagine there might be some questions. Are there any questions on this point?
You know when you said the words of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala don't change? If someone came forward and said, well, the verses of Quran and Kareem are abrogated, isn't that Allah's words changing? How would you respond to it?
It's a very good question. So what does abrogation mean? Abrogation is nasakh. So in the Quran and in Islamic law, what we have is, we have this idea that there's certain verses that have application for a certain period of time, and then Allah Ta'ala disapplies those. The law changes. Here what we would affirm is that Allah Ta'ala's word hasn't changed. That Allah, when this word was spoken, for example, the law was legislated, for example, of whatever we're talking about, like alcohol, there was a time when it was permissible, then there was a time when it was disliked. Don't come to the prayer unless you're intoxicated until you know what you're saying, and then it was stay away from it, it's religious, right? So what we affirm here in this doctrine of nasakh is that the ruling was as Allah wanted it to be always. There was no material change there in terms of the way Allah's irada, Allah's mashia was. It was always to be time limited. Then what happens is when the next ruling comes, it replaces the previous ruling, yes, according to the way we understand it. But in reality, this is not a change for Allah, because that's just a continuation of the irada and the mashia and the qudra of Allah regarding those ahkam. And that's how we deal with all of the nasakh, mansukh type issues. Are there any questions on this side?
How come Muslims can't eat certain things?
Good. How come Muslims can't eat certain things? So as Muslims, what we do is we don't do what we want to do. We don't live life based on our desires, our whims. What we do as Muslims is, in this world, we ask ourselves, what does Allah want me to eat? What does Allah not want me to eat? And we're being tested around those things. And then we will see, did you pass the test? Allah said, don't drink alcohol. Did you stay away from it? Allah said, make sure you only eat halal. Did you only eat halal? And then when you stand on the Day of Judgment and you say to Allah, Ya Allah, whatever you told me to eat, that's all I ate. Whatever you told me not to eat, that's what I didn't eat. Then Allah will mean that in the Day of Judgment, that would mean then for Allah you passed the test. So this world, remember, is a test, and all of these things have to do with the test of being a Muslim.
Would it technically be incorrect to say that Abu Bakr radiallahu anhu is the greatest Sahaba because Isa alayhi salam fulfills the condition of being Sahaba?
No. Isa alayhi salam, we wouldn't. The thing is, Isa alayhi salam, when you say you fulfill the condition of being a Sahabi, what do you mean?
He met the Prophet and then
Yeah, so there's a number of answers to that. So one answer to that is that the Anbiya that were there spiritually. But from the conditions of the Sahaba anyway, there's certain strict conditions that you had to meet the Prophet ﷺ in his physical lifetime while he was there in physical body. The Anbiya that came, they were there with what they call jism mithli, like a similar body. It's quite a complex question, but simply put, we don't say that. We don't affirm that Isa alayhi salam is a Sahabi in the way that we affirm Abu Bakr Siddiq radiallahu ta'ala to be a Sahabi. Sayyidina Abu Bakr is the greatest of all of the Sahaba. No. So are we not limiting Allah? So the answer there is no. Because what we do there is we're saying that the qudra of Allah, The qudra of Allah, it's not that it doesn't relate to the impossibilities because that's a limitation. It's because that then becomes a flawed existence. Because whatever the qudra of Allah will relate to, that thing will then come into existence. But then it's logically impossible to say that it's an impossibility and a possibility at the same time. You see? So that's why we would say that it doesn't relate to the impossibility. It's not by way of limitation or inability, it's just that it doesn't relate to those things because it would result in an impossibility. Somebody else had their hand up. Yeah.
Do you know how we do this? Say things like the possibilities, the impossibilities and stuff like that. Isn't that like create a conception of God which could be like not right?
Remember, we have a concept of God. When we say conceptualization of God, we as Muslims have a concept of God. The concept of God that we have is this that we're talking about. Our concept of God is He doesn't have a body, He doesn't have a place, He's free from direction, He's Qadim, He's Azali, He's Abadi, He's Khaliq, He's Raziq, He's Mumit, etc. etc. That's our conceptualization of God. Well, as part of that, what we also affirm is that He can't be La tudrikul afham, that He can't be understood by the intellect. Again, that in not being able to be understood by the intellect, that's part of our conceptualization. So when we say conceptualization, we're not talking about limitations. We're just meaning how do we understand Allah as a concept for us as Muslims. So we have no problem with conceptualizing God.
So remove all the attributes for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Are they just from the glorious Quran or they from hadith?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. So what we would say about the attributes of Allah, they are what we deem tawqifi. What does tawqifi mean? Tawqifi means that you can't just make up the attributes. So for example, I can't turn around and say, oh, like I'm explaining this, oh Allah, the one who filled my fridge. Like you can't call upon Allah with these attributes. You call upon Allah with the attributes of the Quran and the Sunnah have affirmed. The attributes of Allah are what we call tawqifi. They're not based on our own understanding and our own additions. So famously you have like the 99 names of Allah Ta'ala. There's a hadith of Tirmidhi Sharif which mentions those. It goes along the lines of whoever memorizes them, there's hope that that person will enter paradise. So memorizing the names of Allah Ta'ala, it's a very rewardable, very blessed act. Any other questions?
How does Allah sit on His throne?
Sorry?
How does Allah sit on His throne?
Okay, so let's deal with the question. So the question that was asked is, how does Allah sit on the throne? So let's deal with the question. So, firstly, would we affirm that Allah sits? No. Would we? No. Why do we not affirm that Allah sits? Because creation, that's creation, isn't it? Sitting is the attributes of creation. Number one is to do with being fixed in a place. Right? I'm sat here, so I'm not sat there, am I? I'm not sat over there, I'm not stood up. So this idea then is it limits me to a place. So when we're limited to a place, then that doesn't fit with Allah Ta'ala. So we would never ever say that Allah sits on the throne. Anyone who says that Allah is sat on the throne, that's a misunderstanding of the verses of the Quran. Make sense?
Do you know how the
Sorry, I think
ulama,
there's a question. Just saying. Sorry.
Why do we not call him
If Allah Ta'ala, see, the hardest questions come from the ones where you least expect it. If Allah Ta'ala has no gender, right, so we affirm that Allah Ta'ala has no gender. If Allah Ta'ala has no gender, then why do we refer to Allah Ta'ala as He? And that just goes back to the sense of the way we use language. Right? So the way we use language, the way the Arabic language is, the masculine form includes the feminine form. The masculine form, that's in English as well, by the way, that's in English as well. So in English laws, for example, they don't say he/she, they say he. And you can't just turn it on and say, it says, he should not rob the bank, and then all the women start robbing banks, so it said he, not she. Right? He includes she, even in the English language. Likewise, in the Arabic, there are certain instances where the masculine includes the feminine, but sometimes, although the word form is masculine, it's not masculine to do with gender. It's masculine to do with other attributes like being great and magnificence and power. The way the language is used by the Arabs, it's indicative of that power and that. It's not to affirm a gender. That's simply how we would answer that question. Does that make sense? I'd be surprised if it did work. I'll explain to you afterwards. That's my niece, by the way. ask more questions. Any other questions? Yes.
You know how the ulama say that if you have like an understanding of Allah, then it's not that something beyond that. From everything that we discarded, how would you like understand the saying of the ulama?
So that just means that anything that you bring into your mind, that you grasp in your mind that this is Allah, Allah will be different to that. Why? It's not talking about understanding His attributes, like He's Qadeem. So we've understood He's Qadeem, He's different to that. It doesn't mean that. It means anything that you picture Allah to be. Because whatever you're picturing is based on your grasp of creation. That's why Allah will be different to that.
Is there like a comparison?
Yeah. Any other questions? Yeah, just so there's one more question here which I'll deal with. So the question that's been asked is how to cure depression. How to cure depression. I mean, look, depression, I mean, our master mental health counselor's not here today, unfortunately, but you might watch him online. Right? Depression it's a medical thing. It's a medical thing. So you have to understand that you should also try to seek medical assistance. Speaking to the doctors, speaking to mental health professionals, this is not against Islam. You tie your camel first and then you depend upon Allah. Here, tying the camel would mean what? Seeking medical help. There's also the medical side of things that you should do. There's also spiritual things that you should do. In regards to the spiritual and the religious things to do with depression, and this isn't like the minute you're depressed and you can't deal with anything anymore, even when you're feeling a little bit down, you're feeling a little bit upset or worried, the ulama mentioned, read Surah Al-Duha. Read Surah Al-Duha. وَالضُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى. That surah, read it all, read it a few times, and what you'll find is that you'll start feeling better. Why? Because this surah, when it was revealed at a time when the Prophet ﷺ was feeling down. When the revelation came, and then the revelation didn't come for a long time, and then the kuffar of Makkah was saying, oh Prophet ﷺ, Allah has left you, Allah has abandoned you, Allah has done this and this, and the Prophet ﷺ was feeling a little bit upset. The Quran came down, وَالضُّحَى وَاللَّيْلِ إِذَا سَجَى مَا وَدَّعَكَ رَبُّكَ وَمَا قَلَى. Allah hasn't left you, Allah hasn't abandoned you. So it was there to give peace to the heart of the Prophet ﷺ. If that's what it did to the heart of the Prophet ﷺ, then anyone in creation, if you're feeling down, if you're feeling depressed, read Surah Al-Duha, that will be beneficial. But, and this is important, tie your camel first. Take medical help as well, and spiritual help as well. Do both things hand in hand. Allah will give shifa, inshallah. So I'll just finish on one final point. As you can see, look, the youngsters are running around, they make noise. I say this regularly and I'll keep saying it, right? Nobody should be bothered or be mindful of that. Look, children are children, and it's prophetic in nature that you are accommodating of children. Because these same children, like for example, these ones that are running around, in 2 years' time they aren't going to be running around. In 2 years' time they'll be start listening, right? They'll be start paying attention, they won't be making noise. But those very children will feel that the deen is something that they can link with. They feel that the deen is something that's welcoming. And that's where all of us come into play. If I start turning and giving dirties and saying, oh my God, that kid is running around, and oh no, that's not the prophetic way. Prophet ﷺ, as we learn from the Shama'il, he loved children, he was very accommodating of children. So you have to have a little bit of sabr, yes, you have to have a little bit of patience, you might have to listen a little bit harder, but that's your sacrifice for these children. Imagine that sacrifice, and this isn't beyond Allah. Imagine your sacrifice of just being a little bit patient with this child, and these children become the next Imam Abu Hanifas of the time. You'll get a reward for every single good action that they did because you didn't turn them from Islam. And really that's the reality. So try to be patient with them, try to be accommodating with them. But the caveat to that is, that's only for the children. If you're a little bit older, or you're a little bit of an elder, or you're not a child, you've got your senses about you, you shouldn't be talking in class. You should be paying attention in class. You shouldn't be talking to each other, etc., etc. You should be listening. Because you don't come to class to just find out what's happening. You have plenty of time for that afterwards. It's a class, it's not a youth club. I say this all the time. It's a class, it's not a youth club. You don't come to mingle, you come to learn. This is me talking to the elders. You see, the tone has changed. When we talk to the children can do whatever they want. They can pick this up and have wrestling matches with it and it's all fine. But if you're a little bit older, then it's a part of your duty that you then pay attention, you then listen. If the elders start talking and then the youngsters start talking, then I might as well close the book and we'll all just have a chat. Right? We're not here to have a chat. We're here to learn the deen. So those of you that are a bit older, please remember that you're in a class. So you shouldn't be talking, you shouldn't be messing around, you shouldn't be on your phones, this, that, the other. It's a half an hour class, 40 minutes, and then that's it. Afterwards, you have your time to talk and chill and all of that. So please, just a polite reminder, do bear that in mind, inshallah. So, inshallah, that's the, if there are no further questions, that's the end of class. Inshallah, I'll see everybody. Those of you that have benches, just it's easier for the people who pack away if everyone puts their own bench away. If one person just puts one bench away, it's very much easier rather than leaving the benches with everyone.